would be like.
Yes, my pleasure. So, Donald, do you want to say briefly your interest in diversity in the media? You have to unmute, I think. So I just want to.
I've read the Inquirer since I moved to Philadelphia in 1959, no, 1965. And I've been involved in diversity through a public interest law firm for 30 years on their board.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and start and welcome you all. My name is Aviva Perlo, and this is Coping Cafe, and this is episode number 8. And it's been a thrill and an honor to be producing these shows and interviewing people. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for coming on and taking your time today. As many of you know, Cheryl works at the Lenfest Institute of Journalism in Philadelphia, and Lenfest owns the Philadelphia Inquirer. And her entire job, which I think is so cool, or maybe it's more, I don't really know, but her whole purview is focused on ensuring equity and diversity and inclusion in the media across Philadelphia. And in the brief opportunities that she and I have had to, in planning and prepping for today, I have found out that it's actually quite a few different things and tasks in order to accomplish that goal. It is everything from, from building community, from reaching out, from reaching in, from editing, from, I'm sorry, excuse me one moment. I don't know how to turn that sound off in this moment. So, and so we look forward to hearing. So I've actually prepared a few questions, and I'm asking Cheryl, this is going to be like an organic conversation. Coping Cafe, I'll just say briefly, so the vision is that we can spark meaningful dialogue, and that has an impact in reshaping what's happening in society. And in particular around coping, that there's so many different things. And people say, well, what's your real interest? So how would mental health and violence and social justice and how the news impacts us and how the stories impact us all be connected? And the answer is they just are. They're very deeply interconnected for many reasons. So it's very cool and added bonus to have people on this call that are journalists and writers and interested in social justice. So I write a little bit, and I'm a social worker, so this is very cool. So maybe Cheryl, you can just start us off by telling us. I do want to let everybody know as well that this is being recorded and it is going on my YouTube Live, and I do hope to leverage this and write about this and archive it and take this conversation even further in the circles that it can go beyond the Zoom as well. So I just want to be transparent with everyone. And this is going to go for 1 hour, and we'll end promptly at 2:00, and we will have more time for Q&A. So Cheryl, just start us off with what's it like to be in your job right now in this role at this, at Lenfest, which is huge and awesome, and in this time of this period of history.
Yeah. First, thank you, Aviva, for creating the space of the Coping Cafe. I think in all times, but specifically in the time that we're living in right now, figuring out how to cope and deal with trauma is so critically important. And thank you all for joining and for allowing me to be on your platform. I definitely understand why some people wouldn't understand the synergies, but I appreciate you having the forward thinking of seeing those synergies between the media and coping and trauma. And so my role, as some of you, as Aviva put out, is to lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for the Lenfest Institute. Lenfest was a bit forward thinking at the time when in the founding, in that diversity, equity, and inclusion was always a key pillar of our work, which I know for a lot of people, they're trying to figure out how to put it in after the fact. We have the privilege of actually thinking about it from the beginning. Now, what I will say, because I want to have an honest and open dialogue, is that it's a journey, right? Like when we first started talking about this work, it was very much just focused on diversity, right? We just need to get more people in seats. And that was our big aim. For those of you who are familiar with the Inquirer, you may or may not know, when I joined at the Institute, we had a real problem at the Inquirer in that while our city is very diverse in a lot of different ways, and specifically in terms of people of color, we found that in the newsroom, only 18% of folks were people of color in 2017. And that was by comparison of like 60-something% of folks in the city. So that was a big disconnect. And so our big first goal was, we got to get that number up. We have to get that number up. And so we did a lot of work to increase the number in the newsroom, and we've increased that by, I think definitely around 10% in the past 2 years, which has been pretty remarkable. Obviously, a long way to go. But
wait, I'm sorry. Can we clarify that? 10% of journalists. Wait, what is the 10% exactly?
That's an increase of the journalists of color in the newsroom. So we were at 18%. We're now at around 28% people of color at the Philadelphia Inquirer working in the newsroom. So, so that was where we started. And we started really at the entry level positions. We had a program called the Lenfest Fellows at the Inquirer, which really focused on hiring high potential candidates of color to come into the newsroom. And that program had a lot of success. It had some challenges, but one of the things that we started to recognize is that, getting people in the seats is one thing, making sure that they're included and making sure they have power to actually enact change to make sure that our journalism is inclusive of all communities is quite another. And that in order to actually achieve our goals and ends, we needed to really focus on those things as well. And so, as Aviva said, that led to my job to expand quite, I don't want to say dramatically, but it's much broader now. So some of the things we do include listening to the community. So that's why things like this I love, because I love being able to talk to community members, hear from you, and share, because we're co-designing this future together. That includes training programs for journalists of color and other marginalized communities. It includes training for newsrooms themselves to figure out how to be more anti-racist and how to understand what structures are actually holding back progress, because we realize that, it's just that people from marginalized communities aren't in these spaces. There are systemic issues that we have to address. And about, how do we create the future that we all want? So that's broadly what my job does. I can get more specific, but broadly, that's kind of how the role has evolved over time.
Right. So excellent. Thank you. So that gives us a good, this is actually very profound. So in order to create change, it happens gradually over time. And in order to bring on more journalists of color at a large city paper, so the first thought was get the people here, get people who are of color here. And then it's like, oh, wow, wait a minute. We have to figure out how to empower voices and have each voice matter, and have trainings and positions to put people in multiple levels, not just in an intro level, like, wow, you're answering the phone for the Inquirer and you're of color, so that's great. But also put your journalism out into the world. So and it really is like kudos to Lenfest for having this mindset way before now. You're right, like many businesses and organizations are like hustling now to try to be like, oh my gosh, what do we do? How should we include? And da 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 da. So that's awesome. Now, obvious question, problematic time with what's happening in the news, in that not only is the world in complete chaos with this fatal pandemic, and just starting to use unrest to address racial inequality. But we also have a situation around the news where people don't read as much. They don't want to read as much. We're not going to, if the show was done, in 20 years from now, you're not going to have somebody like Donald hop on and be like, hi, I've been reading the Inquirer since 1959. No one's going to say that. They've been pushing buttons on their phone and apps and whatever. So now that your whole business is distributing equitable news, what do you do about the general decline in news and the shift in the way people receive information?
Yeah, so I'll start here with kind of a reframing. I don't think there's a decline in news. I think there's a decline in the business model of news. So, and the reason I say that is because when we went into this pandemic, the Philadelphia Inquirer saw a spike in the number of people getting information, going to the site, trying to learn from, unlike anything we have ever seen before. When crisis struck at that level, people wanted local news. And that's a powerful thing because, there's certain things that the Inquirer gives us here locally that we can't get from the New York Times, and we just can't get from national organizations. The problem comes in the traditional model that specifically print papers had, which was sell ads and get some people to pay for the printed product, and that covers your expenses. Advertising is no longer mainly print, as you all know. We're all on Facebook, we're all using Google, and it's a much better way to get return on investment for advertisers. And so they say, I'm not going to invest as much into print, which then hollowed out the business side and led to all of the closures that I know, Todd talked about, the jobs going away, the shrinkages. But that doesn't mean that the news is no longer important to folks. For when crisis comes, people realize the importance. I think what journalism has to do a better job of doing is showing that value in all times. And part of that includes increased listening to folks and understanding what their needs are. Obviously, the traditional journalism model is very much, we figure out what's newsworthy, we tell you what the news is, and you consume it. And I think communities are now looking for a much more collaborative model, which is one of the things that we at Lenfest are working on as well. So, and we have to figure out how to transition to be more digitally focused. And that probably means, there are going to be some changes to the way we do things, just to be transparent. And we don't know what that future exactly looks like. But I think people value the news. We need to actually be giving people what is valuable to them and not be so sure of ourselves that we always know those answers.
Right. So shifting news, Cheryl, when we shift news to digital, because that's what's happening around us, okay, that also means that inevitably we're shifting information to part of the population, but not necessarily all. And one of the things you and I touched on yesterday in preparation for this conversation is that even when you want to do good and you want to, increase equity, you can't necessarily reach everyone, and energy is limited. And at some point people say, these are my goals, this is who my target populations are, this is who I'm going to try to put a little bit more attention or resources or effort. So what we know about Philadelphia is that there's certainly an extreme amount of poverty, and going to be, unfortunately, a lot more every day that passes. Increasing homelessness because we don't have any legislation in place that's holding all the rents or helping people, so on and so on. So how does a shift in news to digital per se, which makes sense given the times and the number of people and the data, how does that work when then more populations are quote unquote left behind or don't receive attention about the proper kind of news that we want them to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different ways that we're thinking about trying to approach that, because it's a complicated question, in that news organizations have to do what it takes to be sustainable, to survive, while also being sure to serve communities. And I know in our conversation yesterday, I brought up that with the current resources that we have available, it's really hard to serve all communities well in one organization. That's my current bias. I'll be clear that that's a current frame of thinking that I have. That's one of the reasons at Lenfest we are really, really big on collaboration, because we believe that each actor in what we call the Philadelphia news ecosystem brings value to the table, and reaches communities that maybe another news organization can't reach. But let's say for the Enquirer is the biggest newsroom in Philadelphia. They're able to do investigative reporting and deeper reporting than a lot of other news organizations, just because they have more mass. And so, I don't know if you all saw the recent reporting that they did on the tear gassing in West Philadelphia, and they had an accompanying documentary, and it's just beautiful, because they have those resources. But the Enquirer may say, hey, we want to partner with Al Dia to get this in the hands of the Spanish-speaking community, or we want to reach out to the weekly Chinese Metro to reach out to those communities to make sure that this news is still disseminated, but recognizing what are their core competencies and where they should focus their energies for the greatest impact of all. So that's one. The other thing that organizations are thinking about in terms of the business model itself is a term that we call membership, which is different than digital subscriptions. So digital subscriptions, if anyone goes on the Enquirer website, you read 5 to 10 articles a month, it shuts you out, pay or come back next month, which is, basically, for certain populations, especially the ones you were talking about, Aviva, that becomes complicated. And it may leave out information. Now, places like the Enquirer with coronavirus coverage have made that free. It has no paywall limit. And they did that by design to make sure that those communities who need information are not left out because they don't have $10 a month to pay. The membership model, by contrast, allows everyone to read as much content as they want. And then they ask, hey, if you find this to be valuable, can you contribute to the expenses that we are providing? And so that model was designed really to try to address the concern that you're bringing up, Aviva, that there are some people who need the information who can't pay, but that hopefully there are people who are reading it who have the ability to pay and pay, well, and to subsidize in some ways those costs and help make sure that the information is going to the community it aims to serve. None of them are perfect, but these are some of the ways we're trying to address that concern.
Okay, now help me understand something, and pardon my cluelessness here, but Lenfest is one of the largest, multi-million, incredible model of philanthropy that has really supported all kinds of journalism, hospitals, Bryn Mawr, lots of things across Philadelphia. So, and you have these successful models where you're giving out grants to different organizations and collaborating. So where, and then you have this model of, I guess it's called high innovation or innovative high impact news. So for someone who doesn't know all the numbers or doesn't come from a business background like yourself,
You told me.
how does someone understand, how does the Philadelphia news situation compare to other news situations across America in terms of resources? And
In terms of what, I'm sorry?
In terms of resources and partnering and collaborating and stuff like that.
Yeah. So just as kind of a background, I'm sure many of you have heard of Jerry Lenfest, the billionaire who kind of started a lot of different enterprises. There's the Lenfest Foundation, which really focuses on education and things like that. We're a separate entity, but those are our brothers and sisters over there in an adjacent place. But we do have a very unique model in that we own the Inquirer, but we're what we call a non-controlling owner. So because we accept donations on their behalf, we obviously could not also be in control of managerial decisions and maintain the editorial independence of the Inquirer. So we have a very complicated system that I won't dive into for this, but I just wanted to clarify that. In terms of how does Philadelphia compare to other cities in terms of journalism? I'll say that it's hard to compare two cities in a lot of ways, just because, as you all know, cities are fraught with histories and, the fault lines and things like that. But we have, because of the role that Lenfest plays and other organizations play, we really have a thriving ecosystem here in a way that we don't see in a lot of other markets. So there's a lot of collaboration. We actually have a collaboration hub called Resolve Philadelphia, in which 30 news organizations collaborate to write stories about economic recovery and the challenges with the economy. That originated here in Philadelphia, that model. Other cities have tried to replicate it, but we are by far the leader in that. Because of the model with the Inquirer, we're able to raise funds and add philanthropy to the mix for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a lot of other major market newsrooms don't have that. So that puts the Inquirer in a great position as well. And this is really a thriving market of different news organizations that serve different communities. Now, that's not to say, I don't want it to sound like, hey, there's plenty of things going on, we're all going to survive and thrive, and there's a lot of challenges. But if we're talking comparatively to other cities, Philadelphia is really in a great position and really poised to lead the way in terms of what the future of a news ecosystem in Philadelphia, or in a major city, which was our charge from Jerry Lenfest before he passed, can look like. And that's our goal and aim, and we are seen nationally as a leader in this work.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so let's dive in. So I was just, as I was telling you, I was just reading the Inquirer from this weekend, and I was reading this article about the tear gas in West Philly, and I did not realize that it went on for 2 hours. And the Inquirer did an awesome job of covering this, and yet the long-term impact of the trauma on some of the families of Philadelphia, of what is occurring now, and other people on this call know this. Todd runs the MLK Day for the city, and if you just see somebody on a spotlight day, that's one thing. But if you see, like we all, if you look at long-term, and it said that some of the families are living in hotels because the gas was too strong for the little kids. A 6-year-old, it was talking about a 6-year-old who couldn't breathe. So it's an interesting question. Even when you do an excellent job of covering the news, what is not in the news? Not because that the reporting is not good enough. The reporting's awesome. It's because we as humans are not even understanding the impact of our actions. So can you just speak to the sort of long-term, short-term of what's happening?
Yes. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have around trauma in journalism, because journalism, as I know you all know, sometimes just reading or watching or things can be traumatic in and of itself. And, you know, people are like, I need to turn this off. I need a break. In journalism, a lot of journalists, specifically journalists from marginalized backgrounds, you know, with journalists of color, we're seeing movements with trans journalists and things as well, are talking about the trauma that they experience, specifically covering stories and communities that they come from, and dealing with the role of objectivity. And it's supposed to be, you know, I'm taking a step back, I'm just observing. You're observing, but you're living at the same time, and balancing that dichotomy. And so, and another conversation that we're having as well is about the trauma that we can induce as journalists, by asking people to tell their stories, or sometimes going into a community to get a story when trauma strikes, and then leaving and not coming back until another trauma strikes, and the role that we play in perpetuating that trauma. So all of these conversations are happening, and they've been happening for a while, but they're starting to come to the fore now. And going back to Philadelphia kind of being a leader in a lot of things, we actually here in Philadelphia are having a center started that's focused on gun violence reporting, and that's thinking about how can reporting help to reduce gun violence or not perpetuate gun violence. In the way that, you know, in the 80s, we started to change the way we reported on suicides, to help reduce the rates and, you know, not trigger folks. Right. And in that session, there was actually one of the sessions where mothers who lost their sons to gun violence, and the role that journalism played in that. And a few of the mothers brought up the fact that journalism traumatized them in that process. And what could we do to help? What resources are we providing in stories about trauma? You know, if we're so with Besieged, then portrayed about the tear gassing, are there resources that we provide to folks if you need, you know, if you need to talk to someone, or if you need a place to stay, or things like that? How are we thinking about our role as being more than the observer and the recorder, but an active participant in communities? I don't think we have the answers yet, but I think it's a really good question that we have to grapple with.
Right. So I'm going to step out of my hat for a moment as lead facilitator on this call and step into a hat as participant, and just share briefly that, so the guy that started Better Gun Violence Reporting, I'm friendly with. His name is Jim McMillan. And I've spoken to him and consulted with him on a number of occasions, actually invited him to some of the coping cafes. So it's brilliant. And he did convene over 200 people at WHYY this past year. I guess you were there. It's wonderful. So, and I was personally affected by gun violence as a teenager. And so I have devoted a lot of my life to that work as well. And I am so thrilled to hear from Jim that he's encouraging journalists, and everybody knows it anyway. It's not the journalist, that it's also a systemic thing that, you know, if someone is shot and killed, or shot and rushed to a hospital, or any of the sort, you know, rather than just say at 3:00 on July 21st at the corner of 52nd in Baltimore, you know, a young white male or a young black male, you know, was shot, and, you know, and that's like the extent of what it is that, like, oh my God, like, wait a minute, you know, well, this person has family and friends and loved ones, and then the whole community is scared, and then the 3-year-old who was down the street getting a popsicle heard it and saw it and is now scared that that's how life is, and the innocence is ripped. And so in just true, like, fashion, I don't believe that it's fully a journalist's responsibility to provide the care in between the reporting episodes. It's, you know, it's the social workers, and it's the public health. And I think also Philly is working very hard on that front, but it's great to have them intertwined. So, but that's a really, thank you. I just share all that because I do believe it's super important. And I'm afraid that you know, as we see, one of the next big phases after being concerned about COVID is the pent up energy that people have had from being in their houses for 4 months. And not everyone has been, you know, knitting masks and watching Zooms. And some people are completely, that energy unfortunately is not being monitored, and it's going towards creating more of our unnecessary violence. So let's talk about, in terms of unnecessary violence, can we touch on the how does Lenfest talk about or approach the concept of reporting on the violence that might be done on behalf of people in authority, such as, say, police or elected officials? How do you all handle that? And that's, which is different than saying, oh, the black man at 52nd in Baltimore beat the CVS in, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to equity. I will say Lenfest, again, we don't cover anything. So through projects like the initiative for better gun violence reporting that I brought up earlier, which is a grant, you know, we actually just recently made a grant to them to really expand on that work. We hope to push the conversation forward. But as you alluded to earlier, Aviva, one of our core tenets is about high impact journalism, public service journalism. And I think, you know, I know we have a few journalists on the call. One of the most important things is about holding power to account. That's, you know, journalists, you know, that's what so many people get into this industry for, to really be able to tell the stories of the community and hold the powerful accountable. And that's why journalism is so important to democracy, as that check on power. So that's a really important part of our work. And I think the Inquirer's work as well, you know, the story we're talking about today, and various other stories about racial profiling that the Inquirer has done, and really, you know, about Glenn Mills and the things that were happening there. Various stories about state violence, and the fact that they had to be held accountable, and leading to lasting change, which is the power of journalism. And that's why all of us are so passionate about it and work so hard to make sure that it's going to be equitable, because when it gets it right, it's critical to holding power accountable.
Great. So how about we open it up to Q&A, and you might need to unmute yourself, Drew.
Cheryl, thank you. I have a couple of quick questions for you. One is, you know, it's true in any profession, but certainly in journalism, how important it is to have a mentor or mentors. Does Lenfest have a framework for you to have that? And, you know, in order, you were talking earlier, Viva, about it's not just getting in the door, but climbing the ladder, having influence. And in order to do that, you need to have somebody help you, hold your hand and pull you up. Is that part of the process there? Second question is, as a Black journalist, are you assigned to stories to cover the Black community, and how do you feel about that? And finally, with just in journalism in general, in newspapers, big chains are swallowing up small chains right now, and it's inevitably going to, I think, hurt the feeder system to get to papers like the Inquirer. There are just fewer opportunities for young journalists out there. So if you could comment on any of those, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for those. I'll try to make sure I hit all of them. So the first question about mentorship, it's a great question. And part of the reason, and obviously you're a journalist, so you know this, it oftentimes is hard to know like where to go next. And that is increasingly difficult when you're part of a marginalized community. So as we were thinking about DEI, one of the things, again, I told you all, I love to listen to people. And so one of the things that we did as we were starting to evolve our thinking to not just getting people in the seats in early career, but thinking about what it means to gain access to influence and power, was we asked folks, what is it that you need? What is it that you want? And so we had a survey late last year specifically geared toward just people of color working in journalism or media. And from that, one of the key things we found out is that most people of color neither have a mentor nor are mentoring someone else. And that was actually number 2 in terms of things people were specifically requesting. So from that insight and a few other insights in that survey, we started to build out a program specifically geared toward mid-career journalists and media professionals of color. And one of the things within that program is specifically mentorship. So pairing them with someone in a more senior position to help coach them, both in a specific skill of focus that they want and generally on, here are the soft things that no one's going to tell you about how you need to navigate a newsroom to advance. So yes, that's a very key part of the strategy. Obviously right now it's going to be really small just because we're trying to test what works and what doesn't work in that mentorship relationship. But the goal is to hopefully expand it over time once we find some success there. In terms of journalists of color covering communities of color, that is one of the tensions that I think newsrooms are constantly struggling with. It is a dichotomy, and I think it really goes down to person by person. I speak to a lot of journalists of color, and some of them want to focus on their community. They want to be able to tell their stories in their voice and really be able to add that context and richness. And other people say, I just want my beat. And I'm going to approach every story the same, and I'm going to be sure to include this lens in everything that we're doing. And so it's a really tricky balance. I have to be honest, and I think it really goes down to person by person. I'm not a journalist, but obviously my work really focuses on this work, and that works for me, but I know other people, it's like, I just want to do general work. So that's on an individual basis. And then regarding the newsrooms, kind of the smaller chains being swallowed up and the feeder system going away, that's part of the reason why we started our fellowship programs to get people into the Inquirer, people out of school or with limited experience, because we recognize that feeder system that kind of was the traditional model no longer really exists, and it's also why we will never let go of the early career work, just because it's really important, but it's unfortunate what is happening currently with kind of some of the smaller chains and kind of the current way things seem to be trending. So I'm hopeful that we can help in terms of the feeder system and helping get people trained, but in terms of some of the other mechanics happening, it seems a little bit more dire, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Other questions? Donald? Oh, he's frozen. Donald? Okay. You have to unmute. I'll just add real fast. So Cheryl's job is actually not a journalist. She is on the business side. She studied business at Drexel, and she looks to ensure equity and build the partnerships. And I'm probably not saying this in the official way at all. So please correct me. You want to explain a little bit more about
Yeah. So Lenfest is a nonprofit that's focused on finding sustainable business models for local journalism. So we own the Inquirer as a test kitchen, but we don't in any way work on the day-to-day of producing journalism. So in my role, I get to work on the nonprofit side of things. and thinking about how to create more equitable journalism through kind of different, what we call programs or projects, in kind of the more for-profit term. So really, my role is in a way like a project manager, really designing and implementing projects or programs that will help us achieve our goals of advancing equity in journalism, specifically here in Philadelphia.
Like an entire job is just allocated to that, which is so awesome, because it's like, of course it could be useful, but not everybody does that. So it's awesome. Okay, so it looks like Todd had to hop off, but I did want to hear also, so we'll come back to that. Donald, you've got your unmuted. Here we go.
Yes, I am unmuted, and I have several questions. So I'll ask one or two and then see if other people want to jump in before I finish. And the first one is just feedback for you and management. Why doesn't the Inquirer invest more in making its app work better? It is a very poor functioning app. That being said, you pass that on. I think you've heard it from others. So
it's in progress. I promise you that work is in progress.
Yeah, it's been in progress for too long.
I agree. We actually recently at the Inquirer hired a new head of product who kind of is leading that strategy. So I think you'll see some really promising updates soon. That's all I'll say on that.
And I'm sure it's not under her purview either.
No, it's not.
All I want to do is be able to click and sign in without having to every time go to my password. I'm trying to order these. First, in terms of using resources, given the nature of incomes of papers other than the Times and the Journal and places like that, do you allocate resources for national reporting? And the reason I ask that is it seems to me that that's a place where there could be significant savings by relying on things like the Associated Press.
So again, I'm not in the day-to-day business operations of the Inquirer. I'm pretty sure that the answer is no. There is no longer any national correspondence. We lean to AP, but again, I don't work at the Inquirer explicitly, so I don't, those management decisions are really up to them.
No, I understand that, but I also know that you're talking to them and you can give them feedback from others. So something that I thought of as we were talking and fits within Viva's title of creativity is, if the Inquirer were not to look at itself solely as a news organization, but also to be providing other kinds of services, so that you could take the people that Aviva talked about, the child with the ice cream who's traumatized, and if the Inquirer would take on that kind of project as well, it would focus itself more on being a public interest entity and could attract more funding because of its public service and not so much because it's only providing the news. Just a thought.
I'm going to jump in. I think it's impossible to suddenly, you're serving ice cream and then you're supposed to be selling trampolines. It's very hard. We all want to stretch ourselves to do so much good. That's one of my own things that I'm working on. And it's comes down to having limited energy. And I think part of coping and part of surviving COVID and part of surviving a traumatic situation that prolongs itself over time. There's not a clear end date. There's not like this is going to be over on, August 23rd, is about prioritizing our energy and having to make smart choices or making choices and hope that this is the best way to allocate. And I would say it's true both on a macro, on a systemic level, on a nonprofit level, on an inquiry level, but also with the individual. Like, how much are we sleeping? How much are we eating? How much are we walking and getting exercise? How much are we, to be frank, like cutting out the news so it doesn't overstress us? And which news are we taking in? And as Drew brought up, like, who are our mentors in this moment? If we need to call someone and say, oh my gosh, I'm nervous. I do just want to briefly mention that this show is also dedicated to the memory of Linda Krieger, who worked for the Inquirer for 11 years, who passed away last month. Not from COVID, from a brain complication. The name of her book, Gut Feelings, Social and Emotional Struggles with Crohn's and Colitis. And I think that the stresses that we struggle with take root and appear through the body. So while we're talking about the news, it's also that the stories that we're hearing impact how we're doing. So I'm going to jump in, and I want to say that we haven't covered the elephant in the room. I can't believe I didn't mention it yet, which is to say that we're getting a lot of news that is not true, that it is not real. And we're being, and it has a humongous impact on us as individuals and society. And it, one thing people think, it's like, oh, let's have an argument. I'll kill you. I'll print my gun out and I'll shoot you because you don't believe the way I do. But beyond that which doesn't solve anything, the question that emerges is, how do we know what is true? How do we stop this undermining of trust in the news? And what is it doing there anyway? What is it serving? And the whole racial segregation, complete BS. Why should we hate someone else because it makes us better is also part of the undermining of the truth of how the universe actually works. And if we recognize more that we're all connected, right? I mean, this is one of the most key things is the stories that we're getting. What kind of stories are they? And then what do we do with them in our minds and our hearts and our soul? Cheryl, do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Yeah,
that little
absolutely.
Question.
yeah, that little question. I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned through research, we did a study, I think in 2018, called Being Informed, which was a study on information habits of Philadelphians. And one of the things that we learned was that people took news from places they trusted. And that may be an influencer online who they trust. That may be, a news organization, and maybe all types of things. But depending on who they trust can be the source of the misinformation or disinformation that they receive. And so, if we just, research shows, if we just spit, here are the facts, this is wrong, that doesn't work. People get firmer in their belief of the facts. And so part of the work that we do at Lenfest is really about increasing community relationships between journalists and community members to help counteract that lack of trust and feeling like, oh, these aren't real people, right? And saying like, no, these are people from your community. These are people who care about you, and build those relationships with community members so that when the news and the facts come out, that people believe it. I mean, and can use that information to increase the agency and make the best decisions for their lives. And so that's a big part of the work we do with trying to increase listening and what we call community engagement between journalists and the community to help improve those relationships and increase trust in verifiable information.
Drew, can you just in our last 2 minutes, in these last 2 minutes, tell me about those 30 years that you are a reporter at CNN. And tell me about how you think the change over time in reporting, like, what's the big impact on society from how it was when you were doing it and how you see it now?
It's a huge topic within the industry right now. Is what is a journalist anymore? Is our obligation to be right down the center on everything and just say he said, she said, just report the facts, ma'am? Or is it to take a look at and to be an honest broker and say, no, that is not true. It's not equal weighted. You can't try and balance a story by giving 50% here, 50% there. You've got to, so there's the debate is activism journalism good for society, or is it part of the silo atmosphere that's been created that makes everybody say, I'm a Fox viewer, I'm a New York Times reader, or something like that. So there is a debate that's going to go on for a long time, but it's certainly different than it was when I started out.
Right. So in wrapping up, thank you. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to go there, Drew. In wrapping up, I just want to say, am I an activist journalist? That's a fabulous question. I was not familiar with that term. And I just want to, offer I hope that we're always activist human beings in that we're improving ourselves and really treasuring each day and noting that it's, if not now, when, because just life is too short to not be that way. I want to just, if anyone can offer, what you're taking away from this, and we'll close out. Sandy, anything, what you're taking away?
Every one of these that I've attended, I leave stimulated. So there were terms and ideas that were thrown out that I'm just going to chew on and think about, and particularly the idea of as a business model for journalism, what is the responsibility of the media in dealing with the consequences of what they're reporting. So I'm really, really interested in that, and we'll explore that further.
Great.
I took away actually how amazing Lenfest was to have put this thing together, and how special Philly is that it has this, and that you can have something like Resolve because of having this Lenfest support network. So I hadn't really realized how impactful that was.
Donald, you're on mute. Okay, you're on mute. Let me unmute you.
I think he has to unmute himself, doesn't he?
Can you unmute?
Finally.
Frozen.
He's in Maine.
Oh.
That's what he gets for being on a lake in a cabin in Maine. Great. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for your time and your courage to jump in here and let us ask you 1,000 things. And thank you for what you're doing in the world. It's really amazing.
Again, thank you so much for having me. This is a really great platform. I was glad to be able to join you all and it's good to get to know some new folks in our area who are doing great things as well. So nice meeting you all.
Take care. I'll be in touch.
All right, thanks.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Aviva, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandy. I'm like, thank God Sandy just clicked on. It says admit Sandy Freed in the waiting room.